I'm Julie Green. I'm the Southampton town historian. We're here at the Nathaniel Rogers house, built at the turn of the 19th century, and then Nathaniel Rogers, a miniature portrait artist, then enlarged the house, remodeled it in the Greek Revival style that we have here. It's important to know where we've come from in order to move forward. History is very cyclical, and we learn quite a bit. And if we don't learn from our past, then we're worse off in our future. This gentleman, Nathaniel Rogers, kind of embodied. He was born of a Bridgehampton farmer, so he knew agrarian life here in the late 18th and early 19th century. He went on to pursue the arts, which is what the Hamptons has now become. We have numerous art fairs and things that go on out here in the summer time, as well as galleries that are promoting the arts. And he was, of his day, the preeminent miniature portrait artist. And I kind of beg to say that the railroad that came here in 1870, that if people got off the railroad today as they did in 1870, that they would recognize quite a few buildings, and that sense of place is very important here in the town. The Bridgehampton Museum will have this building open on Fridays and Saturdays throughout the summer months, and probably in the fall they'll go to a little bit scaled back, but definitely on the weekends it'll be open. Some of you I know, some of you I do not know. Most I guess I should know. I do know. So as Nina mentioned, I worked here when it was the Bridgehampton Historical Society before we even changed our name. So I think we're going on, my son's 17, so about 17 years. And in the interim, I went on to work for the town as the town historian part-time, and now I am full-time with the town. So, and I work part-time, of my full-time at the town, part of that is working with the CPF fund, which is the Community Preservation Fund that made this building a reality, made it possible to be as beautiful as it is. I kind of think this is like the CPF's historic gem here in Bridgehampton. So the Nathaniel Rogers house was built, or more correctly, remodeled and enlarged by a very well-known miniature portrait artist named Nathaniel Rogers. He was born here in 1787, here in Bridgehampton, and he enlarged the original federal, we think it was a federal-style home that was built sometime between 1797 and about 1810, and we know, had done some research. We were trying to date the building, and I found an auction for an earlier building on this property that was owned by gentlemen that were Fordhams from Sag Harbor, and that went up for auction. And I believe at that time, Abraham Topping Rose, whose home is the newly, that's actually not new anymore, right? It's been restored for quite a bit of time now. So that's where he lived, across the street. But he started here. His father bought this property from that auction sale in, I think, 1822, 1824. Abraham Topping Rose was newly married, gave his son this property, and Samuel, his father, the doctor, he comes into our story a little bit later. He lived on that property. So this part of the building, when they were restoring it, the architects found that there was architectural details here that predated the 1824, so that's why we think it's a little bit earlier. So this is one of the older rooms in the building, in the house, that's still kind of intact underneath. So where we're standing, all of these rooms, parlors, north, were added in 1840. So this is what Nathaniel Rogers did. He bought a federal style home, and then he bumped out the front, put on the columns, the cupola, and all the things, the balustrades, all the things that make it a Greek revival, and as it's been noted as the best Greek revival, finest example on Long Island, and maybe in New York State as well, now that it's been restored for sure.
But it started with that?
So this was the original house, was this back part here. It was probably a federal style house. It could have been what they call a half house, where it's just, you know, the door is either on the left or the right side of the house. You've got two windows down and 3 up. And it was called a half house because some people, when you started, you were only able to afford to build half of it, and then it got its mirror image. So an example of that is the William Corwith House, which is the other Bridgehampton Museum building. You can see, so now it's a center door, 5/4 windows and a center door. That's what this might have eventually been made into, other than Nathaniel Rogers coming in and saying, no, I want to do something a little grander. So the house is on the State and National Register of Historic Sites, as well as it's designated as a town landmark. And being designated as a town landmark is the better landmarking, because it's got more bite. This house will always be here. It will never be taken down unless Mother Nature has its way. So back to the designer of the house. So Nathaniel Rogers, as I mentioned, was born here in Bridgehampton in 1787. He was born to John Topping Rogers and Sarah Brown. John Rogers, his father, was a farmer. They lived out in the Hayground area and on a farm out there. Sarah Brown, his mother, was the Reverend at the time, Reverend James Brown. He was the minister, the local Presbyterian minister at the time. So I also, as a little bit of an aside, so Nathaniel brother John married Phoebe Corwith. She lived in the home that stood where the other part of the Bridgehampton Museum, the William Corwith House. So she lived there, and their son, Charles Rogers, went out west in 1833. He brought a bunch of his Corwith cousins out there, and Rogers cousins, and they mined lead in Illinois. So just want to point it out. So the other building that we have, that the Bridgehampton Museum has in its compound, is also part of the whole Rogers. Everybody's related. And Charles Rogers, not only did Nathaniel Rogers come back after making his fortune painting in New York City, came out and built this beautiful building, which later became part of the town. Now the town is given back to the town. Charles Rogers came back out in 1877, and he gave the money for the Hampton Library. So after attending the local district school here, Nathaniel, known as Nathan by his family and friends, was apprenticed at the age of 15 to a shipbuilder up in Hudson, New York. Hudson's actually about 30 minutes south of Albany. It was actually a contender for a state capital at one point, and then Albany was chosen. So he went up there to be a shipbuilder's apprentice. He was artistic, so he was drafting, he was drawing pictures of ships, as well as constructing ship models. But according to his own words, he said that he really did was he was there to keep the accounts, pay off the workmen, and serve out the grog. So he was, I don't know how much drafting he got done up there as a 15-year-old boy, but about a year into his apprenticeship, he cut his knee very badly at the time, was sent home to convalesce here in Bridgehampton in the Hayground area with his family. And at the time, Dr. Samuel H. Rose, who I mentioned earlier, who was Abraham Topping Rose's father, who lived across the street, was a doctor, and as he was helping him mend his knee and convalesce with him, he gave him, the story goes that he gave him paper and pencil and watercolors and said, you are an artist, follow this. So he followed that. He moved into New York City in the early 1800s, and by 1811 he had started being instructed by another famous, so I should even mention, does everybody know what a miniature portrait is? So we have a Nathaniel Rogers original over there. And that's a large...
That Julie acquired for this organization,
yes, well,
I'd like to say.
A board member
yes,
purchased it and donated it, but yes, I did.
But Julie is one.
So, so that's one that we have here of a gentleman. It's a little bit bigger. At the time, there was no photography, so if you wanted an image of your loved one, you would have a miniature. So they were like the early, the early pictures. So this one here, this is Nathaniel Rogers. This is his, his selfie. So that's a portrait of him with his little cigar, and that is actually held at the National Academy of Art and Design in New York City. His miniature portraits there. They're usually about that big. They're kind of like a big brooch. You put them at your your nightstand, so they were they were easy transportable, so that you would carry them around. And then when photography came in the mid-19th century, bye-bye miniature portraits. So he's in New York City. He's studying under a gentleman named Joseph Wood, who was the eminent miniature portrait artist of the day in New York City. He's rapidly getting attention. He's rapidly building a clientele. He's going out, he's painting all the people of the day. They are these wealthy people. So just like everything, really only the wealthy could afford these little miniature portraits. And so Wood, his teacher, leaves for Philadelphia in probably about 1812, 1813, and he leaves New York City kind of open for Nathaniel to take over as the man to go to for your miniature portrait, and which is exactly what happened. So from about 1811 to 1830, 1839, he is the one to call on to have your portrait painted. So he had a studio.
Can he earn a living, a good living?
Yes, he earned quite a substantial. Just from miniature portraits.
Do you know where in the city his studio was?
So his studio was at 1 Cortlandt Street, and he lived at 197 East Broadway. So this is all downtown Manhattan, because there wasn't really an uptown at this point. It's still everybody's living further downtown. And it's interesting because it says that he had a studio from 1820 to 1839, and then he came out here and retired. But I found a newspaper clipping of a fire that happened in 1840 in New York City, and it's kind of a funny fire because he owned it's where his studio was, and it had a jeweler was there and a baker, and Nathaniel Rogers were all using this one building, and they didn't suffer a lot of losses. They were able to control the fire pretty quickly, and it could mean that he didn't lose anything. He didn't lose any paintings because he was already kind of establishing himself, retiring out here. But the baker lost.
The bread? They
joked about like his stuff all got wet, turned back into dough. So, anyway, so that was where he was in the city. And then he's at the time, I didn't really even realize that they were exhibiting their artwork just like today. So he first exhibited at the American Academy of Fine Arts in 1817. He showed 1 to 5 or more miniatures at the Academy every year to 1824. And then he was elected to the American Academy in 1825. And then he went on to found the National Academy of Art and Design, which is in New York City, which I mentioned, own his miniature portrait and that of his wife. Speaking of his wife, they married in 1817. She was Carolyn Matilda Dennison. She was the daughter of a whaling captain in Sag Harbor. He was 30, she was just 16. So they were engaged, December affair. So they had 6 children, 2 daughters and 4 sons. Most of their children did not live past the age of 40. One child they lost very young. One daughter went on to marry. She moved to Wisconsin. One son became an Episcopal minister, but he died at 31. Another son went on a ship, died at sea, just 2 days out of Sag Harbor. Kind of sad, like really, truly sad. But fortunately, when Nathaniel died in 1844, his children were all under the age of 21, so he didn't suffer the loss of these children. His wife, however, did lose some of her children while she was still alive. And the youngest child, James, who became a doctor, he had gone to Williams College. He practiced medicine in Sag Harbor, and then he didn't die. He was born in 1829, and he died in 1901. So he was the longest living of their children, and he had a home in East Hampton, right on Main Street, and he summered in Florida as well.
That's an interesting time span, 1829 to
1901. Imagine all that you see,
Wow.
And it's pretty fascinating. Yeah. So, and as I mentioned, so Nathaniel died in 1844. He was 57. It is believed that he contracted tuberculosis in 1825, which slowed him down considerably, and he died at the age of 57 here in Bridgehampton. They are all, not all of them, but he and his wife and some of his children are buried here at the old cemetery next to the Presbyterian Church. If you can see over there is his headstone, and it is that very, very Greek, plain, austere, but quite impressive headstones, marble headstones that they have over at the cemetery.
Can I interject one thing?
Yeah.
The lettering and the font on that headstone and on others at that time were utilized and studied by Jonathan Heffler, who created our logo and our new sign, and he's incorporated some of the elements of that lettering into our signage. So it's a type of lettering that lives on.
That's fantastic. No, it's all great and amazing because it all comes full circle. Because he was, and Nathaniel Rogers is also known to have been the designer of the Presbyterian Church. He started this building in 1839, 1840. So he's building this. The Presbyterian Church is being built in 1842. Abraham Topping Rose, which I'll talk about in just a sec, he's building the house across the street around the same time. So this was called the Bull's Head, and it was quite active at that time, in that period of kind of 4 years. And he is said to have been instrumental in the design of the Presbyterian Church. It's also said that he used Menard Lefebvre, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name. He was an architect. At that time, there really wasn't somebody denoted as an architect. They were usually builders. And he put together these books that we believe that Nathaniel Rogers probably peaked at least, to get some of these beautiful detail work that are over the doorways, and all the dental work is just quite magnificent. So we think he used those books. Being an artist, he probably had an eye for all of this amazing work that you can see around. So back to Nathaniel Rogers, pre-passing away, he buys this property in 1839 from Abraham Topping Rose. So Abraham Topping Rose's father died in 1832. He kind of inherits that. There was an earlier building on that property as well. He inherits that property. He puts this piece up for sale and says it's the finest piece in all of Bridgehampton, except for the piece I own across the street. So the only reason he's selling this is because he has a little bit better piece across the street, which is where he built that house that we know today as the Abraham Topping Rose house. Here in the collection, there is a letter from Mrs. Frances Corwith, to her son Nathan, who had moved away to Illinois. She writes a letter in 1839 saying, making improvements at Bullhead. Nathan Rogers has bought Lawyer Rose's house and is making a large 4-chimney house with a cupola on top. So she misspelled cupola. So we know that the cupola was original to the building of the house, and the 4 chimneys, which is kind of, we have contemporary letter. So the art historians do recognize Nathaniel Rogers as one of the leading miniaturists in the early 19th century. Currently, the Metropolitan Museum Art has about 7 of Rogers miniatures in a display of 30. So he's got a big proportion. There's 30 that are on display. They rotate them out. They're not always on display, but of the 30, he has 7 showing. He didn't always sign his artwork, so there are art historians that can tell the difference between who's who. So he has some stylings of light, the way he used light for skin color and all that stuff. And there's, people that argue that his were not as nice as this other, but they're beautiful. So, and you have to think how tiny he's painting. So his wife, Caroline, dies in 1857. She dies out in Wisconsin, where she's visiting her daughter, Helen Rogers Manning, and they were in Wisconsin, but she's brought back here for interment. So she's interred with Nathan and their son and some of their other children that predeceased them, 2 children that predeceased them. So our next owner of this gorgeous home was Captain James Hunting. He was a whaler from a big hunting family. The Sag Harbor Whaling Museum, that is a hunting house. That's his grandfather's house. Benjamin Hunting. So he, after whaling, James Hunting comes to Bridgehampton. He goes into the mercantile business with a gentleman, a Nathan Newton Tiffany, who there's still Tiffany's that are in East Hampton. They are related to the jeweler Tiffany, but way back. Their relations go way, not any early or of the day relations, but way back. He owned it until 1857, and then from 1857 until 1873, he built the house that used to stand just to the south of it. He kind of carved out acreage for himself, and he built a house which was torn down, and now there's a new house there.
Right.
It's also very sad. That's the house that stood. That's the house that Captain Hunting built. The mansard roof. Probably the only one we had here in Bridgehampton, and it's now. James Hunting had one daughter and his wife, and the three of them lived in this enormous house.
I think I'm walking.
Yeah, so then he owned it. Then it got sold a few times. One of the notable owners was Auguste DeBost. The DeBost family were known for starting the summer colony in Southampton Village. His brother, Leon Dupree DeBost, was very well known for starting that colony around Lake Agawam. So Augustus came here, bought this place. They used it for a short period of time. There are newspaper articles about them enjoying it, having firework displays for everybody in the hamlet. He then sells it to somebody who flips it, and then it turns Miles B. Carpenter, who was also the proprietor of the Canoe Place Inn at the time. So he buys this, turns it into a boarding house, and it was called the Hampton House at the time of his ownership as well. Carpenter dies in 1889, and his will is in dispute between his family. This house is just languishing here for about 5 years. Finally, it goes up for auction, and Captain John Hedges and Frank Hopping purchase the property and turn it back into this Hampton House. What's one thing that's kind of interesting about Carpenter's ownership? His manager of the boarding house that he hired was named Edward Storms, and he was a ticket collector on the train. So at the time, the train only came to Bridgehampton in 1870, and this was the terminus. It didn't go further to Montauk, East Hampton, Montauk until 1895. So for 25 years, you had to get off the train here, or you took the little train into Sag Harbor Village. So he was kind of doing business deals, like, I'll rent you a room if you. When Carpenter died in 1889, as I mentioned, his will was in dispute. They have this auction sale. The money goes back to Captain James Hunting's wife, his widow. So the Hedges and Hopping team of father-in-law and son-in-law held the house as the Hampton House, made it this fashionable resort, and they ran it as an inn or a boarding house until 1949. So during that whole expanse from 1895 to 1949, school teachers stayed here. It was a local spot to come. I mean, there are people that remember it as a house to come and have dinner and those kind of things. So it was open till 1949, but it wasn't quite as the summer colony resort, because that's, we're going through 2 world wars, so life is a little bit different here in Bridgehampton during that time. It wasn't as fashionable as it had been. So fast forward to 2003, there were efforts to save this house began. I think even maybe a little bit earlier. There was a 500 signature petition from the community members urging Southampton town to acquire this building. And I don't know if any of you, we might have some, we have plenty of pictures throughout of what it looked like at the time of the purchase. The Hopping family lived pretty much in the back wing, which was the only part of the house that has been taken down and replaced with a new wing. The rest of the house was just restored. But they lived in the back wing primarily. The rest of the house was just kind of heated, and that's just really kind of about it for quite a few years. So when the town bought it in 2003, historic structure report was done, and basically it was just whatever they needed to do to save it from further deterioration at that time. Actual restoration work didn't start until about 2007.